Adventure Ledger presents Shadows in the Sun, Episode 9. Oliver's breath caught in his throat as Marco's men led him into the room. The door creaked shut behind him, and for a moment the dimly lit space felt suffocating. Marco stood in the center, his expression cold, arms crossed as he sized Oliver up. The tension was palpable, and Oliver knew this was no ordinary meeting. This was the reckoning. "Matthews," Marco said, his voice low but sharp. "I've been hearing things that don't sit right with me." Oliver swallowed hard, trying to stay calm. He had to tread carefully. He'd been playing both sides for too long, and the consequences were catching up to him. "I'm loyal to you, Marco," he said, forcing the words out. "I've been keeping an eye on Cruz's men, feeding you information." Marco's eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer. "Is that so? Funny thing is, Hector says you've been a little too close to Luis lately. Care to explain that?" Oliver's heart pounded. Luis's name had come up. He needed to pivot fast. "Luis is the real problem," Oliver said quickly. "He's been pulling strings behind the scenes, trying to weaken your control. I've been working with him to expose his plan, to help you take him down." Marco didn't respond at first. He simply stared, the silence stretching between them, making Oliver's skin crawl. "You expect me to believe that you've been working for me this whole time?" Marco's voice was flat, almost bored, but the danger in it was unmistakable. "If that's true, why hasn't Luis been dealt with already?" Oliver could feel the noose tightening around him. "He's smart, careful. He's been keeping his plans quiet, but I've heard enough to know he's going to move soon. If you give me a little more time, I can bring you proof. We can stop him before it's too late." Marco studied him, his gaze cold and calculating. For a moment, Oliver wasn't sure if he had convinced him, or if Marco was about to finish him off. Then Marco stepped back, crossing his arms again. "You want more time?" he asked. "Fine, but if I don't see results soon, I'll make sure you regret it." Oliver nodded, relief flooding through him, though the tension remained. He wasn't safe yet. Marco was giving him one last chance, but Oliver knew the clock was ticking. Luis had to be dealt with, and fast. As Marco turned to leave, Oliver felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He had to betray Luis. There was no other way. But could he live with that choice? He had no time to think. He needed to move quickly, or Marco would come for him. This was the beginning of the end. The prison felt heavier as Oliver made his way through the dimly lit corridors, the echoes of Marco's ultimatum ringing in his ears. He had promised to deliver proof of Luis's betrayal, but he still hadn't figured out how to make it happen. Every step felt like walking on a tightrope. One misstep, and everything would fall apart. Luis had been his ticket out of this nightmare. But now Oliver saw him for what he really was. A puppet master, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Luis had framed him, orchestrated his entire downfall. The realization sat like a lead weight in his chest. Now, the man he once thought was his only ally was just another threat. Oliver's mind raced as he approached Luis's cell. He needed to stay calm, act like everything was normal. Luis couldn't suspect that Oliver had turned on him, not yet. If Luis sensed anything, all hope of playing Marco and Luis against each other would be gone. He knocked on the door, and after a moment Luis appeared, his usual sly smile playing on his lips. "Oliver," he said smoothly, "I was wondering when you'd show up. Things seem tense around here lately." Oliver forced a smile, though every fiber of his being screamed to run. "Yeah, Marco's tightening his grip. He's getting suspicious of Cruz's men." Luis gestured for him to enter. The room was dim, lit by a single flickering bulb. The walls were bare except for a small table covered in papers, maps of the prison, notes about guards, supply routes. Luis was always prepared, always one step ahead. It was why he had survived so long. "Let's talk," Luis said, sitting down and leaning back in his chair. "What's the situation? You've been quiet." Oliver swallowed hard, keeping his voice steady. "Marco's planning to move on Cruz's remaining men. He thinks he's close to wiping them out, but I've heard whispers that he's losing control. Cruz's faction might not be the real threat anymore." Luis raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Go on." "It's you," Oliver said, his voice lowering. "I've heard that Marco's men are getting nervous. They think you're making moves to take over everything. Cruz's black market, and Marco's control of the guards. If he figures it out, Luis chuckled, the sound low and amused. Marco's always been paranoid. That's why he'll never win this game. Oliver's pulse quickened. The pieces were falling into place, but he still wasn't sure if he had the courage to go through with what came next. Luis's laughter died down as he leaned forward, his eyes locking onto Oliver's. So Marco's paranoid, and you're telling me he's coming for me now, huh? His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it, as if he were sizing Oliver up. That's not news, Oliver, but what's your angle here? Why are you really telling me this? Oliver felt his pulse quicken. Luis was too smart, too calculating to miss any detail. The room seemed to shrink around him, every second stretching as he weighed his next words carefully. He needed to stick to his story, keep Luis from seeing the truth, that he was about to betray him. Because I need out, Oliver said, his voice steady, but the tension in his gut twisting tighter. I've played both sides for too long. It's only a matter of time before Marco turns on me, and if I'm not aligned with you when that happens, I'm as good as dead. Luis studied him for a long moment, the flickering light casting shadows across his face. Interesting, he said finally, leaning back again. But that doesn't answer my question. Why tell me now? You could have kept this to yourself, waited for Marco to make his move. Oliver forced himself to meet Luis's gaze. Because I don't trust Marco. I never have. He's ruthless, but he's also reckless. If he takes you out, the whole prison will fall into chaos. The guards, Cruz's remaining men, they'll all turn on each other. I don't want to be caught in the middle of that. Luis's smile returned, thin and sharp. Smart, you're thinking ahead, playing the long game. He paused, then gestured to the door. So what's your plan, Oliver? You came here with something in mind. Let's hear it. Oliver's heart pounded in his chest. This was the moment. He had Marco's backing, but he needed to make Luis believe he was still on his side. Marco's already got men watching you, Oliver said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. I can distract them, give you time to move the shipment you've been planning. After that, you disappear, and I'll take care of Marco's suspicion. Luis didn't say anything for a long time. His eyes searched Oliver's face, and for a moment, Oliver was sure he had pushed too far, revealed too much. But then, Luis nodded, a slow smile curling his lips again. I see. You want to be the one left standing when this is over. Clever. Oliver forced a smile in return, but inside his mind was spinning. He had just sealed his betrayal. After leaving Luis's cell, Oliver's heart was still racing. He had just made his choice. He was going to betray Luis. The conversation had gone smoother than he expected, but that didn't make the weight of his decision any lighter. Luis had been his only way out, and now Oliver was throwing him to the wolves. As he walked through the corridors, his mind churned with conflicting thoughts. Was he doing the right thing? Betraying Luis would buy him time with Marco, but what would it cost him? Luis had saved him once, given him a chance when no one else had. But now that Oliver knew the truth, that Luis had orchestrated his imprisonment, it felt different. Was it even betrayal, or just survival? The prison felt more dangerous than ever, the tension hanging over every corner. Guards patrolled with sharper eyes, and the prisoners moved in tighter groups, sensing that something was about to explode. Everyone could feel the shifting power dynamics. Luis was playing his hand, Marco was making moves, and Oliver was trapped between them. He passed by a group of Marco's men, their eyes narrowing as they watched him. Hector wasn't with them, but Oliver could feel his presence lingering like a shadow. Hector had never trusted him, and he wouldn't stop until he exposed Oliver for the double dealer he was. Oliver's mind spun with plans, strategies to stay ahead. He knew Marco expected results soon. He had to deliver Luis into Marco's hands and fast. The question was how to do it without putting a target on his own back. One slip-up, and both sides would turn on him. He ducked into a quiet corner of the prison, leaning against the wall as the weight of it all settled on his shoulders. There was no turning back now. Luis's downfall would come soon, and Oliver had to be the one to set it in motion. But could he really outmaneuver someone like Luis? Someone who had been playing the game longer than anyone? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. Mateo, one of Marco's lieutenants, appeared from the shadows, his expression serious. Marco wants to know if it's done, Matteo said, his voice low. Oliver nodded, pushing off the wall. Tell him it's happening soon. Luis thinks I'm on his side. We'll get him when he least expects it. Matteo's eyes flickered with doubt, but he didn't push further. Fine, but don't take too long. Marco's patience is running out. As Matteo walked away, Oliver felt the pressure tightening around him. The trap was set, but he had to move quickly before it snapped shut on him. The following day, the prison's atmosphere grew even heavier. Oliver moved through the yard, every glance feeling like a knife in his back. Luis had no idea what was coming, and the weight of that knowledge gnawed at Oliver. But he couldn't turn back now. He was too far in. Marco's men were ready, lurking in the shadows, waiting for Oliver's signal. The plan was simple enough. Lure Luis into a secluded part of the prison under the pretense of discussing the next shipment. And once he was isolated, Marco's men would move in. Clean, swift, and without drawing too much attention. But nothing in San Sebastian ever went as planned. Oliver approached Luis in the yard, keeping his expression casual. Luis, he said, nodding toward a quieter corner near the old storage area. We need to talk about the shipment. Marco's men are getting suspicious, and we need to move fast. Luis looked up from the group he was talking to, his eyes sharp but curious. All right, he said, standing. Lead the way. Oliver's heart pounded as they walked together, every step feeling heavier than the last. This was it. Luis trusted him enough to walk into the trap without question. Part of Oliver felt a sick satisfaction in how easily Luis had fallen for it, but another part felt something darker, guilt. As they reached the storage area, Luis glanced around, his usual confidence unwavering. What's the plan? He asked, leaning against the wall. Oliver hesitated just for a second. But in that moment, Luis's expression changed. His eyes narrowed and his posture stiffened slightly. He wasn't sure what it was, maybe a shift in Oliver's voice or the tension in his movements. But something had tipped Luis off. You seem nervous, Oliver, Luis said, his voice low. What's going on? Oliver's pulse quickened. He needed to keep control of the situation. It's nothing, he said, forcing a smile. Just trying to stay ahead of Marco's men. Luis took a slow step forward, his eyes locked onto Oliver's. No, he said quietly. There's something else. Just as Luis spoke, Marco's men appeared, stepping out of the shadows. The trap had been sprung. The air in the storage room thickened as Marco's men surrounded them, their footsteps echoing like the final toll of a bell. Luis's eyes darted from Oliver to the guards, realization dawning on his face. The calm smile he had worn moments before faded, replaced with cold fury. Well, well, Luis said slowly, his voice sharp. So this was the game all along? You're betraying me, Oliver? Oliver's stomach twisted, but he forced himself to stand tall. You set me up, he said, his voice steady despite the pounding in his chest. You framed me. This was always about you pulling the strings. Luis's eyes darkened, but there was no panic in them, just the steely resolve of a man who had played the game long enough to know its dangers. You don't survive in a place like this without making moves, Oliver. I did what I had to do. One of Marco's men stepped forward, grabbing Luis by the arm, but Luis didn't resist. He simply looked back at Oliver, his gaze piercing. And now you're doing what you have to do, Luis continued, his voice calm. But don't think for a second this ends with me. Oliver felt a chill run down his spine as the weight of Luis's words settled in. He had won, but at what cost? Luis was right. This wasn't the end. There were still forces at play beyond the prison walls, forces that had orchestrated his downfall. But for now, he had survived. Luis was dragged away by Marco's men, but before he disappeared into the shadows, he cast one last look over his shoulder at Oliver. You think you're free now? Luis called. You're just as trapped as the rest of us. As Luis was taken away, the air seemed to shift. Oliver stood alone in the storage room, the silence pressing down on him. He had done it. He had betrayed the man who had controlled him, the man who had ruined his life. But instead of relief, all he felt was the weight of the choices he had made. Marco appeared from the doorway, his expression unreadable as he approached. Good work, he said simply, nodding toward the spot where Luis had been taken. But don't get comfortable, Matthews. There's always more to be done. Oliver nodded, though his mind was far away. Was this survival? Or was it just another step into a deeper trap? As Marco turned and left, Oliver remained where he stood, staring at the empty room. The prison around him hummed with life. But inside, Oliver felt a hollow emptiness. Luis was gone, but the system that had put him here remained intact.
This is the end of the episode. Thank you for listening. If you like the story, please subscribe to our channel and check out our other stories. You can find the link to the next episode in the description below. What do you think about this episode? Let us know in the comment section below.